For approximately 30 seconds after beheading, the brain does not die. It remains starved of oxygen, but alive with electrical signals. It is a storm of fading consciousness. A severed head may retain awareness. During this time, the eyes might blink. Lips may try to speak. An echo of life lingers as the body grows cold. This gruesome half-minute was likely experienced by Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII and one of history's most infamous executed queens. While history books often gloss over these details, a closer look reveals a torment far more chilling than a mere executioner's swing. Her final days were not just an end. They were a masterpiece of psychological destruction. Anne's execution serves as a grim reminder of Tudor England's brutal justice. A world where death was not the end, but the final public act of a meticulously planned humiliation. This is the story of how a king broke a queen, not just with an axe, but with the terrifying power of silence, suspense, and the slow, deliberate erosion of her very soul. By May 19, 1536, Anne had already spent 17 days imprisoned in the Tower of London. It was the very same fortress where she had prepared for her glorious coronation a mere 3 years prior. Then she was the future, crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now she was a prisoner awaiting the final summons. Her world had shrunk to these cold stone walls. But the true prison was the agonizing uncertainty that Henry VIII had so callously orchestrated. He prolonged her mental torment by repeatedly delaying her execution date. The king had even summoned a skilled swordsman from Calais to carry out the deed. He chose a sword instead of the traditional, cruder English axe. This detail is often depicted as an act of mercy, a quicker, cleaner death. But the truth was far more sinister. The choice of a French swordsman was a spectacle, a theatrical flourish that only underscored the dramatic, almost ceremonial nature of the event. It was a signal to the court and to Anne herself. This was no ordinary execution. This was a performance. Despite the grim circumstances, onlookers reported that Anne demonstrated an extraordinary composure. She seemed almost cheerful in her last moments, making light of her situation with gallows humor. But one psychologist might identify this as dissociation, a defense mechanism activated by severe, inescapable trauma. Her mind, pushed to its absolute limit, was detaching from the horror of her reality. She was not cheerful. She was fractured. Historical records, often sanitized and politically motivated, have overlooked the intense fear she must have felt. Her reputation was being deliberately and publicly tarnished. False accusations of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king were spread like wildfire. What makes Anne Boleyn's execution so profoundly unsettling isn't just the physical act. It is the deliberate, systematic destruction of her identity that preceded it. Henry VIII did not merely seek Anne's death. He aimed to erase her from history, to invalidate her accomplishments, and to undermine the very legitimacy of their daughter Elizabeth. This was not a sentence. It was a crusade. The campaign to break the Queen began not with a sword, but with a pen. The architect of her downfall was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. a man who understood that power is not just wielded, but written. He orchestrated the accusations against Anne. The charges were a cascade of impossibilities. Adultery with numerous men, including court musicians and even her own brother, George Boleyn. Plotting to poison the king. Treason. These claims were so absurd, they would never be upheld in any modern trial. But this was not about justice. It was about creating a legal fiction. A story convincing enough to justify the unthinkable. In the Tower, her ladies-in-waiting once her confidants were replaced. The new women were spies. They were tasked with reporting her every sigh, every prayer, every desperate word. Her grief was not her own. It was evidence twisted and relayed back to her accusers. This was the art of isolation. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Trapped in a web of whispers, where every gesture could be her last. The execution date was a moving target. First scheduled, then postponed, then rearranged. This was not a reprieve. It was a refined form of psychological torment. A cruel game that forced Anne to face her own death again and again. Each dawn brought a fresh wave of dread. Each delay offered a sliver of false hope designed only to be shattered. Her mental resistance was being systematically weakened day by agonizing day. Behind this cruelty lay a simple, brutal political calculus. Henry VIII was desperate for a male heir. He had grown tired of Anne's sharp intellect and political influence. And his eyes had already turned to his next queen, the quiet and compliant Jane Seymour. To marry Jane Anne had to be more than just divorced. She had to be annihilated. Her character destroyed her marriage, annulled her daughter, declared illegitimate. The charges of treason were a convenient tool to achieve all three. The goal was to convince the English people that their once-beloved queen deserved such an end. To transform her from a reformist icon into a monstrous adulteress. The trial was a sham. The verdict was preordained. But the most calculated performance was yet to come. The stage was being set, not just for a death, but for a public lesson in power. The morning of May 19th presented an uncharacteristically bright day in London. A stark contrast to the grim events that were about to unfold. Anne spent her last night praying, yet sleep continually eluded her. Records show she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m, kneeling for hours in desperate communion. By dawn, she had been awake for nearly 24 hours, her mind likely fractured by stress and fatigue. The scaffold itself was a strategic choice. Set up on Tower Green, it was an unusually low platform, only 3 feet off the ground. This was unlike the towering structures seen in movies designed to be visible to thousands. This scaffold was intimate and exclusive. It meant Anne would not climb a grand staircase to her doom. She would simply take a few steps, denying her the dignity of elevation and bringing her uncomfortably close to the taunting, watchful crowd. As Anne neared Tower Green, she would have heard the muffled din of the spectators. This was not a somber, respectful gathering. Historical records indicate a lively, almost carnival-like atmosphere was intentionally fostered. It was a public spectacle, a warning to any who dared defy the king's power, especially women who rose above their station. Prior to kneeling, Anne was granted one last speech. This was not an act of mercy, but a tradition she skillfully turned into her final act of defiance. Her words were a masterclass in political maneuvering. She began, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die." She acknowledged the law by which she was condemned, saying nothing against it. She did not confess guilt, nor did she protest her innocence. By accepting her fate without validating the charges, she subtly questioned their legitimacy. It was an act of profound courage, limited by her fears for her daughter's future and the intense scrutiny of the crowd. Her words were not an expression of free speech, but its very antithesis. The ultimate suppression of a woman who knew even her final utterances would be reported twisted and could endanger those she left behind. Unlike the English custom of placing one's head on a block, Anne knelt upright. A French tradition that increased the executioner's difficulty, requiring immense skill. This position demanded Anne maintain her stillness through sheer will, even as the swordsman prepared his strike. Witnesses stated that her eyes darted beneath the blindfold, a final desperate attempt to hear the approaching blade. The psychological distress of not knowing the exact moment of death was the final unacknowledged torture. The actual beheading was remarkably clean. With a single swift stroke, the swordsman severed Anne's head. But even in this, the horror was not over. The aftermath of the execution is often left out of polite historical narratives. Witnesses claim her eyes and mouth continued to twitch for several seconds after decapitation. A shocking final bodily reaction as the brain starved for oxygen. Some even report her lips forming words as if completing a prayer abruptly ended by the sword. This unsettling scene caused several onlookers to faint, while others turned away in disgust. This was the bleak, fragile bond between body and spirit, severed for all to see. Possibly most tellingly, no fitting coffin was arranged for Anne's remains. Her court ladies, overwhelmed with grief, had to hastily find an old arrow chest to store her head and body. This seemingly small oversight underscores the utter disregard for Anne's dignity, even in death. She was an afterthought. A political problem resolved not a person deserving of fundamental funeral rites. Anne was hastily interred in an unadorned grave within the Tower Chapel, her burial rites abridged to near insignificance. The king's resolve to erase her extended beyond the grave itself. Court painters were ordered to destroy her portraits. Her royal symbols were chiseled from palace walls. Courtiers soon learned that even uttering her name could invite royal disfavor. Henry VIII wanted her memory to vanish as swiftly as her life did. The sanitized, romanticized portrayal of her execution, so prevalent in popular culture, bears little likeness to the reality. The psychological manipulation, character defamation, and deliberate cruelty that marked her final days in May 1536 were horrifying. But Henry's ultimate goal failed. Immediately after the execution, Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. This child her mother executed, and her father publicly rejecting her legitimacy, was effectively abandoned. Yet it was this very child who would later become England's most renowned queen. She inherited her mother's sharp wit, her resilience, and her political acumen. In a final poetic irony, the daughter Henry tried to cast aside would rule England for over 44 years, ushering in a golden age. The true dread of Anne Boleyn's story isn't just found in the drop of the sword. It is in comprehending how absolutely power can alter reality. A lesson that echoes ominously in our contemporary age marked by information control and character defamation. The final sadness for Anne is that even as Henry strove to eradicate her, it was her death rather than her life that became her most lasting impact. Which medieval horror should we explore next? The Black Death or the Spanish Inquisition? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe and ring the bell to uncover more forgotten chapters of history, from the madness of kings to the shadows of the executioner's block.